So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about gender, sex, and sexual diversity and towards more liberatory theory and measurement today. And I'm Dr. Sari van Anders, and my pronouns are she or they. So first, just to start off, I wanted to acknowledge research support from the Canada 150 Research Chair Program. Some of this work was done with former grad students Will Beischel and Zach Schudson and many others in the lab. And I just want to provide a linguistic note that when I use the term minority, I'm referring to minoritized position in a power hierarchy and not statistical frequency. So I'm going to get started. And in today's talk, I want to talk about first why gender sex diversity. And then I'm going to talk about what I call sexual configurations theory and how it can help us think about gender sex and sexual diversity. And within that, I'm going to talk about these neat things we've made called heat maps, and then also a different kind of measurement structure called the gender sex 3x3, and then close with some conclusions. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A at the end. And these are drawn from lab publications, some of these and throughout. So I mostly don't have citations throughout, but you're always welcome to go to my website and see the papers. So first, why gender, sex, and sexual diversity? And I think one of the main reasons is that it exists. And we often think about it when we think about phenomena or people or existences or identities like these ones. We also think about it, though, when we think about existences like these, for example, asexual, polyamorous, monoamorous, and demisexual. And there's also other ones that we don't always put into gender, sex, and sexual diversity, but also do exist, like slut or player or single by choice. And we can actually name these. We can call these partner number sexuality. And I actually would call these like lesbian, heterosexual, gay, bisexual, queer, and sometimes two-spirit is included in this and sometimes not. Gender sex sexuality. And by naming these, we can actually avoid conflating sexual orientation with gender sex sexuality as it typically is. Because when we ask people about their sexual orientation or identity, sometimes they're thinking about these constructs, sometimes they're thinking about partner number sexuality. And there's also individual gender sex, which often gets sort of lumped together with sexuality, but obviously can be separate for some people and sometimes is really connected. So non-binary experiences, genderqueer experiences, cisgender experiences, femme, transgender, butch, and for Indigenous folks, sometimes two-spirit incorporates individual gender sex and gender sex sexuality in ways outside of colonial and Western frameworks. And we can think about how all of these exist, sometimes in tension, sometimes alongside each other, in a diversity framework. We also could think that we also know or could think of gender, sex, and sexual diversity as being important and valuable because understandings about gender and sexuality could be inclusive and reflective of reality, or at least more so than they are. So for example, in questions about gender, sex, sexuality, we often see questions that sort of ask people to slot themselves into either a heterosexual category or maybe this other kind of mixed non-heterosexual or sexual minority category. Sometimes more progressive approaches also ask us to slot ourselves into one of three categories with bisexual in the middle. But what about someone who's attracted to butches? Where would they mark themselves here? What about someone with person, not gender sexuality, who's attracted to people regardless of their gender, but other characteristics? What about someone who's partnered with a genderqueer person? And what about people who are non-binary? These kinds of options really rely on individuals to some extent having a binary gender sex location and the people they're being sexual with or interested in being sexual with also having a binary gender sex location. And even if we say, okay, there's a heterosexual man and he puts himself in heterosexual because he's attracted to women, we still don't know what that means. Is he attracted to people who identify as women, people who have clitorises or vaginas, people with attitudes that are socially tied to womanhood, and so on? And this is also true for gender sex. So we often ask people to slot themselves into a binary of woman versus man. Sometimes more progressive versions have a third option of non-binary, which kind of situates it as being in the middle of the two or maybe outside the two. It's not always clear. And again, we could ask, if you're genderqueer, where would you mark yourself here? If you were a femme man, how would you indicate that? If you were agender, if you were two-spirit, and again, even if you mark that woman box, what exactly are you communicating with that term? So understandings of gender, sex, and sexuality should be and could be more inclusive and reflective of reality. And attending to gender, sex, and sexual diversity can help us do that. And that's because people are the gaps in our understanding. So some of those examples I gave are actual people, they're actual communities. It's not just a theoretical gap or a measurement gap, it's actual people. We also can be interested in gender, sex, and sexual diversity for thinking about connections across and distinctions within gender, sex, and sexual diversity. For example, what are connections or shared experiences between people who are queer or genderqueer and people who are both? What about people who are non-binary, genderqueer, and or transgender? What about people who would use one of those identity terms, but not all of them? What are some distinct experiences people have? And what are some commonalities? And we can also be interested in gender, sex, and sexual diversity because our science and scholarship has an impact on the world. So that's true when it comes to policy, for example, what gets taught in classrooms, who's protected under the law. It's also true when it comes to human rights, who can walk the streets safely, who can express love, who can access spaces for their gender, sex. It's true when it comes to expertise and authority. So for example, whose knowledge counts and who gets to decide that. And also for the concept I've come to understand as hermeneutical injustice, which I've learned from feminist philosophy of science. And it's about the justice of knowledge frameworks, who knows, who is allowed to know, what knowledge is available for whom to make sense of themselves. I don't know if I'm using who and whom right, but so grammar, please let me know in the comments section. Let's have a lively discussion about that. So who gets to make sense of themselves, who counts, who sees themselves in science. And so I want to move from the discussion of why gender, sex, sexual, and sexual diversity to move to discuss sexual configurations theory. And one of the first things I want to do is talk about a lens that I use within it called a sexual diversity lens. And SCT provides new ways to think about gender, sex, and sexual diversity, including various visualizations and also this diversity lens. So as I've been talking about, we can think about sexual diversity in terms of all these different and interconnected existences, identities, and experiences as distinct, but also interconnected. And a sexual diversity lens moves us from thinking about groups as other, which is often how marginalized and minoritized gender, sex, and sexual experiences and existences and identities are studied, or have been anyway. And so this sort of other against an undifferentiated backdrop that moves towards a difference framework, sort of contrasting and comparing this other group with a norm or a majority. And a fair bit of health research still tends to do that. There's this undifferentiated backdrop still. And one of the things, even though diversity sometimes is misused and misappropriated to just mean sort of lots of different kinds of people, the way I use it refers to the fact that we can attend to interconnections and distinct experiences against backdrops that have to do with social location and power. So this is trying to show that even though we could look at these chartreuse circles or these light blue squares, we also could look at sort of all the people with heavily dashed outline experiences and see what experiences they have. So we can group in all sorts of contingent and constructed ways. And in fact, that is how we group. We make up our groupings in ways that are hopefully appropriate for our research questions, but often quite, the construction of that is invisibilized. So this gives us a way to look at particularities sort of deep down. We can look at people who are chartreuse circles with bold outlines and understand what that experience is. We can look at people who have shifted between locations. We can look at people within certain regions, meaning certain social location experiences, with an interchanging lens that acknowledges there's not one natural way to group, not one, that these experiences are dynamic. And it gets us beyond singular groups or group differences. And it helps us also to think from the margins to understand that all these experiences are really important for us to understand the whole. SCT also makes for new ways to think about gender and sex, and it takes us beyond the binary in ways I'm going to walk you through. So the way I define sex in SCT is as biomaterial, bodily and or physical, and or biological and or evolved. And that has to do with aspects tied to femaleness, maleness, and sex diversity. Now, obviously, there's also gender, which I define as having to do with socialization, social groups, and social constructions that have to do with masculinity, femininity, and gender diversity. Now, crucially, there's many aspects of sex. It's not just one thing. So it could be things like voice, body frame, skin texture, genitals, etc. And there's multiple aspects within there. And even what people put into sex versus gender might branch or be dynamic. And this branching and coinciding is really key because we often have what I call alignment normativities, expectations that certain aspects of sex and gender that certain aspects of sex should line up in specific ways, or certain aspects of gender should line up in certain ways, or that sex and gender itself should line up in certain ways. And we need to understand that they very, very commonly do branch and also sometimes coincide. And as there are aspects of sex, there are also aspects of gender. We might think of things like interactions, comportment, norms, or structures. And I talk about gender sex as being a place where sex and gender intertwine, having to do with people, identities, or specific aspects tied to gender sex diversity, womanhood or manhood, girlhood or boyhood. And here also there are multiple aspects that might have to do with legal identity, recognition, communities, and felt identity, among many others. And again, people might put these in different places, and that's part of the dynamism of it. And I put them in gender sex because many of these factors have to do with experiences and phenomena that for some people are tied for gender, for some people are tied for sex, and for many people are tied to both. And these take us beyond the binary, not only the binary of men, women, but also the sex gender binary, and also beyond cisnormativity, allowing us to understand and make room for trans and non-binary and genderqueer experiences, again, moving beyond the binary and cisnormativity. And here's just a diagram I have that I love, and it took a lot of time to make, so I want to show it to you as a visual that helps us sort of put that into perspective. Gender sex is the space where these things are overlapping or could be overlapping. Now, within SCT, I also talk about gender, sex, and sexual identity, status, and orientation. And SCT allows for branchiness and coincidence among these aspects as well. So what do I mean by them? We often think of partnered sexuality as being related to three facets: orientation, status, and identity. And we might define orientation as what people are drawn to, what feels right, and or what resonates, etc. Status, we might define it as what people are doing or will do or have done, behaviors, actions, or existences. And identity is terms and labels people use to name themselves, groups and communities, and the politics and ideas tied to these. Now, orientation is multifaceted. So it's not just that sexuality is multifaceted into orientation, status, and identity. It's also that each of those is multifaceted and has multiple aspects. So we might think of orientation as interest, fantasies, arousal, attraction, etc. And those might be branched or they might be coincident. Status is multifaceted as well. So we might think of it as dating, flirting, cuddling, penetrative sex, etc. And so while orientation and status can branch from each other, various aspects within each can branch. And identity might include things like labels, politics, and community. And all of these can branch and coincide across them or within, or both. And identities are what people tell us. People can locate their orientations and statuses on SCT. So SCT gives us space for people to literally mark down, which I'll show you in a little bit. Now, how does this play out? When it comes to gender, sex, sexuality, there are all sorts of orientations. Someone might be plurisexual, meaning they're attracted to or aroused by people of multiple genders, sexes. They might be heterosexual, they might be monosexual, and so on. Status, we have MSM, men who have sex with men, WSW, women who have sex with women. You might be heterosexually active, and so on. And identity, there's all sorts of terms. And clearly, these are non-exhaustive lists. We can also do this for, if you remember earlier on, I talked about partner number sexuality. So people can be multisexual, non-sexual, unisexual, multi-erotic, uninurturant, which are terms I'll get to in a bit. And it's not necessarily the case that people necessarily are one of these, although for some people that is a ongoing experience. Sometimes people are dynamic between these. They branch within them over time, or even, yes, over time, let's say. For status, someone can be multi-partnered or unipartnered, not sexually active. And of course, there's many identity terms that fall into identities tied to partner number sexuality. And while I don't really talk much about kink-related sexuality in this talk, we can have people who are kink-oriented, people who have a status of being in the lifestyle, and all sorts of identities tied to kink as well. And there might be other aspects of sexuality that I'm not talking here. We might think of like sexual parameter N, beyond gender, sex, sexuality, beyond partner number sexuality, and beyond kink-related sexuality that have existed, do exist now, outside what I'm talking about, or will exist. And we can also use this framework to think about individual gender sex. So it's most commonly applied to gender sex sexuality. And then we can think about it applied to partner number sexuality or kink, but it also can be applied to individual gender sex. So whether people are oriented towards womanness or masculinity or no gender sex, for example, whether people's status is genderqueer, feminine, a femme-man, agender, or so on. And their identity has all sorts of terms. And again, these can branch across, they can branch within. Now, I've been using the terms a little bit, nurturance and eroticism, and SCT doesn't conflate those two or prioritize either. So by nurturance, I mean sexuality that has to do with warm, loving support, and that might be branched into things like connection, intimacy, commitment, or closeness. And we also can have eroticism, things to do with like tantalizing, arousing, genital pleasure or bodily pleasure, phenomena like wanting, orgasm, liking, or heart rate. And these matter in ways I'll talk about for many sexual gender sex sexual existences and identities, and also many partner number sexuality ones. And these can be branched. So your nurturance and your eroticism can be branched. You could be interested in being nurturantly sexual with women and erotically sexual with anyone who turns you on, for example, regardless of their gender or sex. What does SCT look like? So I just usually give people a moment and say, get ready, because I'm going to show you some diagrams. And I once did it without a warning. And it was an in-person talk. Remember those? And I'm glad we can do remote, though, because we have immunosuppression in our family. So I'm so glad I get to share with you, but even though I can't be there in person. But anyway, I was in person and there was this collective gasp in the room. So get ready. I'm going to show you these diagrams and walk you through them. And you will be okay. And we'll circle around a lot. So here's an example of individual gender sex. So what we have here, and I'm not sure, can you see my mouse? You can, okay, it's so great you can now these days. So what this is showing is a binary ring, a non-binary area, a challenge area. You can have branchedness and coincidence. There's a strength axis. You can have multiple locations if you want it on this, and you can also have temporal differences. And I'll just walk you through this person. This person has located themselves as a binary woman and saying that's pretty important to who she is. She's located herself as pretty feminine, but somewhat masculine, and that's somewhat important to who she is. And she's located her sex in a challenge area, with that being somewhat important or relatively important to who she is. And that might be for a lot of reasons. Someone might locate themselves here because they're a trans woman and they see that as challenging the norms for femaleness. Some other trans women won't necessarily put their mark here because they won't see their sex as challenging norms for femaleness. A very muscular woman might put herself here. At many times, a woman who had never given birth could have put herself here, or others would have put her there. Someone who smoked cigarettes or wore makeup. There's all sorts of reasons why people might locate themselves or others in that challenge area. So here's another person who's locating their gender. Sorry, here's gender, sex, sexuality. And here's someone who says they're mostly attracted to women, but somewhat attracted to men. And that's somewhat important to who they are. Here's another person locating their gender, sex, sexuality. They're saying they're attracted to people who are kind of challenging norms for manhood, and that's pretty important to their sexuality. Here's someone who says their sexuality is not gender sex. Gender sex isn't that key to who they are. And for this person, it's not that important to them. And here's someone who says they're attracted to femme women and any queer folks, and also kind of binary, typical normative men. When it comes to the gender of their sexuality, they're really interested in femininity that challenges norms. And that's really important to who they are, and also this sort of normative masculinity. And when it comes to sex, it's not actually that important to their sexuality. So research often presumes that sexuality is genitally oriented, but we know that for many people it's not. And it's actually an empirical question how many people it even matters to. I'm sure many, but I'm sure many it doesn't. And here's a way that eroticism and nurturance plays out. For example, here's someone who says they're nurturingly interested in being with women and erotically interested in, they see it as both gender sexes, men and women. And someone else might see gender sex beyond a binary and locate here. And you can see that they have different marks on strength, how important or how central those locations are to them. We can also do this for partner number sexuality. So here's someone who says that they have multiple sexual partners, and that's important to who they are. Here's someone who says their partner number sexuality kind of is within all partner number sexualities, kind of not really just one or multiple. It sort of is outside that framework. And here again, that eroticism and nurturance comes in handy because this person shows they're interested in multiple sexual partners, But really, that's mostly multiple erotic partners, and they're more interested in one nurturing partner. And so we see that those can branch. And SCT allows us to think of identity, statuses, and orientations in really, I think, capacious ways. So for example, here might be two people whose identities are lesbian, but as you can see, they have very different sexual configurations, with this woman locating herself as interested in women, and this other participant locating their interests as a larger sphere of people. We can also have two people with different identities who actually might locate themselves on sexual configurations in the same way. We can have people who have no identities, unlabeled or post-label, who can still indicate their sexual configuration. And we can also have people locate how they understand themselves versus how others might perceive them, something we're often commonly aware, how they might locate themselves in different contexts. For example, at home, they might move through the world as a woman and at work as a man. And this allows us to get beyond, to address and attend to identity labels, but also get beyond them to the complexity within them and the often shared experiences across them. So how do people use SCT? I gave you some examples, and here's a participant who locates themselves at birth here and currently here and 30% strength. And they say, I was assigned female at birth, have had top surgery, and have been on testosterone for 5 years. I don't plan on having bottom surgery, happy with what T changed. Have little connection to current sex, better than what it was a few years ago, but not ecstatic about it. But flat chest gives me the day-to-day comfort I need for my gender expression. And I'm on the asexual, demisexual side of my sexual attraction, so I don't pay a lot of attention to that aspect of my sex usually. And this was a transgender man. A cisgender man puts himself over here, you can see, in at 50% strength. So even though people think, oh, cisgender majority people probably all would locate themselves in a very just like limited part of the configurations, we find a lot of heterogeneity. So this cisgender man says, I made a mark on the male side because I'm a bit closer to the both genders line because I do not characterize myself as being particularly masculine. In fact, I find most things associated with ultra-masculinity to be frivolous and dated. On the contrary, I display a fair amount of feminine characteristics in terms of my behavior and lifestyle, but nothing too extreme. Again, I don't make a big deal about my masculinity or femininity, so I put strength around 50. And here's a non-binary agender person who has differentiating status and orientation. And remember, I said those can branch. And what they're saying is, although I do identify as agender, I still experience levels of what I consider to be manness and womanness, though I wouldn't consider what I experience to be binary ideals of manness and womanness. I mark my orientation where I did because I fall somewhere close to the middle of the spectrum of binary genders, though I feel I experience more manness than womanness. I also placed it on the inner right because I feel my gender sex is closer to all gender sexes. I mark my status because of how I feel today, which is with a bit more womanness than usual. I still don't feel that I experience womanness in a binary way, which is why I place the dot on one of these inner rings. My gender sex is important to me, but it's not the most important thing to me, so I place my strength at 80%. So I gave you just a few examples of individuals using SCT and telling us why they've marked it the way they did. And we also can do group level usages of SCT. And I want to show you a bit about that. For example, here are some aggregate heat maps for cisgender women. So what we do, it's kind of like if you've seen fMRI images, we kind of overlay the images to provide a heat map. And the hottest parts, the reddest parts, or actually maybe the burgundy parts, are the most frequent responses. So these are cisgender women. And as you can see, there's a hotspot, not surprisingly, at women for gender sex. And there's up there a fair bit for the strength, but there's also marks elsewhere. So even though these are cisgender women, it's not that all women are locating in one spot or that they all feel like their womanhood is central to who they are in the way we tend to assume people do as a culture. Excuse me, still a hotspot at femininity, but lots of variability for gender. And for sex, a hotspot at female, still lots of variability along the sex axis. And of course, what kind of heat maps you're going to have will depend on what kind of women you have in your study. Here's aggregate heat maps for transgender men. We have a hot spot at man. Not surprisingly, these are transgender men, but some variation elsewhere and variation along the gender sex strength axis. For gender, we have a hot spot at masculine, but we have variation all over, including feminine, which again, not all men, including transgender men, have to be masculine, and lots of variation along our strength axis. And for sex, we have some hot spots around male challenging norms and binary locations, and also female. And that's because obviously sex is going to vary in how people experience it. And so though researchers often ask participants about their sex, trying to get at genital sex or birth assigned sex, we know that the way people experience their sex and tell us about that is going to be in ways that are meaningful for them. And so it's really important that our measures are able to facilitate that. And I'm really glad to see people marking where they do in ways that are meaningful for them. And here's non-binary participants, which is probably kind of the prettiest picture because it's got the most color and variation. And when I saw these, I thought they were really beautiful. Lots of location in the challenge area, not surprisingly, and the non-binary area, variation all over the axis for gender sex. For gender, lots of variation, hotspots in the challenge area and also on the more masculine side, and also down here at the non-gendered side. And for sex, our non-binary participants were more likely to be those who understood their sex as female. Again, this is going to vary depending on who's in your study. And as a part of that, I just want to remind you that the groups I presented cisgender women, transgender men, and non-binary participants, but we can have non-binary trans people, we can have trans-binary people, we can have a whole mix. Our groups are always constructed in contingents. So we could group and show heat maps in all sorts of ways. So sometimes the numbers or visualizations can kind of tend to reify reality, and that's not my goal. Or reify reality, sort of create a reality and reify norms, and that's not, reify categories, and that's not what I intend to do. I want to make clear that the categories and groups are always constructed in contingent. We asked participants in our research, has participating in this study made you think differently about gender, sex, gender, and or sex? Uh-oh. There we go. And I was pretty excited to see that over half of cisgender participants said yes or maybe. Just doing our study, just doing SCT made them think differently about gender, sex, gender or sex. And actually quite large proportions of our trans men, trans women, and non-binary participants, again, we're grouping these in contingent and constructed ways, also reported that the study doing SCT made them think differently about gender, sex, gender, and or sex. And we weren't surprised that the numbers might be higher for cisgender participants because our gender, sex minority folks are really the experts and they've had lots of reason to think about this. Now, our participants said, trans men said, though, no, I was just a man before, I'm still just a man. I didn't have any deep insights here, I'm just who I am. And a cisgender man said, yeah, I never knew how others could identify as anything besides man or woman, and this study shifted my thinking. We also asked people, did you feel you were able to describe yourself in the survey in ways you hadn't been able to in other surveys? And you can see these numbers are huge, like to my mind anyway, I hope you agree. The non-binary participants, about 80% said yes or maybe, and over half of cisgender participants and trans participants said yes or maybe, with pretty high numbers. And that's both amazing and also sort of upsetting to think what's going on in other studies. A cisgender woman, though, said, no, I don't usually think about these sorts of things, as typically the female option on surveys is enough to define my identity. And a trans man said, yes, a lot of surveys just ask for male or female. And while I identify as male, my sex is still partly female. So sometimes just marking male doesn't capture the whole picture. We also find that SCT seems to be useful for self-understanding. And so we've done a lot of knowledge translation and made a lot of resources available. For example, a zine that you can access from my website for free, which then has gone on to be translated into Spanish by some colleagues, as well as Italian by a collective in Italy, and Belarusian by some other academics. And we have 3 more coming that you can keep your eye out for. And if you have any languages that you would like to work with, we would be happy to talk with you. We also developed cartoons to explain these and evaluated them in knowledge translation research. And we find that people find them useful and interesting, and they seem to be useful for research, but also for people just understanding themselves. And we also find that this seems to be useful for education, not surprisingly. So we already saw this quote from a cisgender man, but SCT seems to be useful as a pro-diversity initiative, helping people understand what exists out there. A transgender woman, for example, said, I've only ever thought about trans women, but the video just shows how wide a spectrum gender really is. The non-binary is especially fascinating because it makes me question just what is gender and how does everyone express it? It also seems to be useful for clinical or therapy approaches. Like, we didn't set out to do that, but people will tell us after they do it, they like feel like they came to new understandings of themselves in ways that felt therapeutic. And so we're actually working on materials to make it available. And for self-knowledge, for example, one participant says, said, thinking about it really in depth made it more clear about who I am and what I want. I realized some stuff about myself today. Being straight and heterosexual and like female, everything just seems very one-dimensional, but it's not. It's really not. Someone else said, I don't know if I've ever even asked myself this much in depth, what I like and what I want. And indeed, it turns out that, especially for majorities, but not only, we often don't actually sit down and walk ourselves through this. So it ends up being a prompt for many people. And we've been pleased to see that that's true even for minoritized folks who sometimes are forced to engage with their gender, sex, and or sexuality to make sense of the forms of oppression that and discrimination that majority culture puts on them. So you can do your own, you can walk through your own if you like. We're working on a website platform, but right now you can download a workbook and articles and zines and videos to work through it yourself if you like. Probably the easiest way to find it is just to Google my name and SCT. So I'm going to transition from SCT to spend a little bit of time on this other measurement approach we've developed called the gender sex 3x3. Because if it's not apparent, SCT, we love it. It's like really capacious, really comprehensive. Participants find it really compelling. And even those who don't are actually able to use it with a high degree of efficacy and confidence, but it takes a while. So we wanted to develop something else that would be quicker, and this is what we came up with. And I'm really excited just to share with you, Will Beischel, who was the lead grad student on this, is going to be starting as a professor in the fall, or in the summer. So existing measures of gender sex, often one of the most progressive of which is the two-step method that many of you are probably familiar with and that I appreciate. And it asks, what is your gender, for example, and it gives you options, sometimes man, woman, usually man or woman, and then sometimes a third option or multiple options of genderqueer and agender. It also asks a question about what sex you were assigned at birth. So that's the two-step, sort of what are you now or what are you, and what were you then? And it gives options of male and female and sometimes intersex. And that's really progressive compared to what's available. But it still leaves some gaps, which remember are people. Like if you're a butch woman, how do you indicate yourself there? If you're a non-binary man, for example, it still tends to give a list. And one of the things about lists is that people can feel excluded when their existence or experience or identity doesn't pop up. And it also can be problematic to have to use terms or check yourself into a box that doesn't fit you. It centers birth sex by always asking about it, regardless of relevance. And while it gets the trans experience, it doesn't actually get a trans identity. And there's other criticisms that have been made by gender sex minority communities, scholars, and others. So one of the things we were interested in is a measure that could get at binary cisgender experiences of women and men, which is what most of our measures tend to ask, or maybe not our, but most of the measures out there. But also that could ask about and make sense for transgender binary experience as well, which what a lot of measures also assume that they're kind of, when they talk about trans, they're talking about trans women and trans men. But of course, not all folks are binary. And so increasingly, questions are asking about non-binary experiences. But they're assuming and kind of conflating non-binary with trans experiences, identities, and experiences. And there are many people for whom trans and non-binary is a meaningful intersection or one and the same. But there's also people for whom it's not. So we were interested in whether there's a need for, and we were seeing it in our research, a cisgender non-binary category. But we also started to think about these binaries and how they often do harm. And there's increasingly people for whom cisgender or transgender isn't the right fit. And I'm not talking about people who reject cisgender because they just don't like the term or they don't like to be marked because they're a majority and they want to sort of be the undifferentiated backdrop. I mean, people for whom trans or cis doesn't quite fit their experiences. So we call that allogender. And then as we thought about that, we realized maybe there's this other category, allobinary, where binary or non-binary isn't really the right fit either. So this gender sex 3x3 comes from in psych. We talk about sort of 3 levels of one, 3 levels of the other, or something like that. That's how it works to get the 3x3. And we call cisgender, transgender, and allogender examples of gender trajectory, and binary, non-binary, and allobinary examples of binary relation. So the 3 questions for asking about gender sex that we tested and published on include, what is your gender? And we give 2 examples, one majority and one minority, to make it clear it's not a complete list. We also ask, when we describe who participated in our study, which of these categories would you like us to include you in? And there's a lot of aspects of that wording we sort of tested and evaluated. And here are the options we give. And we code C and D, we code those answers. And then which of these categories would you like, and which of these categories would you like us to include you in about binary relation? And again, we've tested and evaluated participants' responses to all of these, including majoritized and minoritized folks. And what we find when we do this research is all the cells are populated. So this is an example from one of our studies with just under 1,000 people, where you can see the sorts of identity terms that people use, and we've that would fit within each of these cells. And what's interesting, if you look at this, is you can see if we just ask people, are you a woman, they would say, or to mark themselves as woman, or if they just told us they're a woman, we wouldn't know whether that means they're cisgender binary, transgender binary, allogender binary, cisgender non-binary, cisgender allobinary, allogender allobinary, right? There's like lots of experiences that go beyond the binary and go beyond gender, a specific gender trajectory locations. You can also see non-binary popping up in lots of places, not surprisingly, the non-binary categories. And there's many others that we could go through to show. This is just not even a complete list because it would be too much. We can also use this gender sex not just to slot people into one of the 3x3, but in flexible and creative ways that allow us to categorize beyond woman or man, or trans or cis. So you can imagine all sorts of creative ways depending on your research questions or other issues that you might want to use this as. For example, you might be interested in understanding binary experiences compared to experiences that fall outside the binary, non-binary and allobinary. You might be interested in what this allogender category is like, including specificities between allobinary, non-binary, and binary. You might be interested in looking at only one cell. What are transgender experiences like that are binary, for example? You might be interested in looking at binary women and men within the cisgender and transgender category. So there's ways to do some of the traditional comparisons or studies or explorations, and also ways to be creative. So it's not a sort of fixed way. It gives us a framework that you can use dynamically with the questions and the analytical framework. And participants understood and liked these questions. We evaluated that, mostly and strongly said yes to understanding and fitting gender and or sex. And this was true for minorities and majorities. And we compared the 3x3 to other methods for asking about gender sex, including the two-step. And what we found is we were able to code more people with it, and it was easier to code, including regardless of the sophistication of the researcher. So, I mean, I like to think our lab has a lot of pretty sophisticated people when it comes to thinking about gender sex, given lived experiences and scholarship and expertise. But some of our coders are new. Maybe they have majority experiences, and they found this easier to use as well. And we found that it was minority inclusive, meaning minoritized folks found the questions and the wording welcoming and validating, and also majority situating. So majorities, even though they might try to say, well, I don't like cisgender because I don't believe in trans existences, we could still code them the way that was meaningful for our research, and they couldn't kind of control that. And we also talk about these guiding principles for the research having to do with participant agency, community knowledge, flexibility, and justice, that all of those need to guide how we ask about and measure gender sex for the gender sex 3x3, for SCT, and in general in our research. So I want to close with talking about why gender sex and sexual diversity, so we have time for questions. One of the reasons is gender sex. It gives us this thing of getting beyond sex gender, of acknowledging bodies, biologies, biomaterialities, as well as socialization and social constructions. It gives us a way, the sexual diversity lens, to understand that groups are constantly contingent and constructed, and we can reformulate those categories in ways that make sense for research or community building. We can look at individual experiences and shared across what we might think of as differences. It gives us the language of branchedness and coincidence, and including across identity, status, and orientation that reflect real people's experiences and help to make sense of a lot of stigmatized gender sexes and sexualities. Excuse me. And it gives us this model, lots of data, and a way to use to collect more data, to expand our understandings of diversity, and so on. Why the gender sex 3x3? It's inclusive. Participants tell us they experience it that way. We can use it for quantitative or qualitative research. It provides a dynamic and flexible way that can fit people's specific research needs. And it gives us both questions and an analytical framework to use in our research. So why gender, sex, and sexual diversity? I will argue that it's more empirical, more scientific, and more just for our research. And I like to end with this anecdote, which is when I was presenting SET at one conference, a colleague who's an expert in gender, sex, and sexuality noted, and some of our participants have also said, they've been able to sort of point to a place on SET and say, there I am. And that doesn't mean that's the only place there are, but they had never been able to see themselves in science or measurement before. And it means so much to me, and it should mean so much to all of us, that people haven't been seeing themselves in our science or our research or our methods or measurement, and that they can. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
We have a question from Haley, who asks, how are Two-Spirit folks represented in the 3x3 method?
That's a great question. And, we haven't specifically looked at or worked with Two-Spirit individuals for this research. So we have looked at intersex communities, trans communities, non-binary communities, cisgender communities, butch and femme communities, and Two-Spirit is one we haven't, in part because we haven't partnered with Two-Spirit and or other Indigenous scholars to do so. So that's an open question.
I'll perhaps ask a question of my own while other questions continue to trickle in through that Q&A. Please do feel free, audience members, to type questions into the Q&A and to upvote questions that you're particularly interested in having answered. And I'm wondering, Sari, if you can tell us whether there's been any resistance to these methods from other researchers. I'm thinking about that hermeneutic injustice, and I can anticipate that folks might say, well, I only have space in my survey for one straightforward question. Have you experienced any of that? And do you have any responses to some of that pushback?
That's a great question. I think for SCT, there's understandable concern about including something that takes a while to do. And so I often say, if your study isn't about gender sex, like that's not a main thing, you're not sort of exploring people's experiences of it, then SCT probably wouldn't be the right fit. I mean, I like to think it would eventually. We're trying to keep refining it and working on it. More of the resistance there is it's really fascinating. So people don't believe, scientists and experts tend to not believe, and by experts, I mean like academic experts and authorities, they don't believe that sort of lay people could do SET. And so I think in part because people who are experts have such set frameworks for understanding the world, and SET really challenges that, whereas lay people, so to speak, are more open and more used to experts defining the world in ways that might differ from the ways that they experience it. I think also because SCT is built with expertise, including from lived experience from minoritized groups. So in that way, it kind of does map onto many people's experiences. So many people tell us, oh, this is the first time I was able to make sense of this. Like even about myself, like there wasn't language before. I didn't have the words. I didn't have a framework. Now I can point. For example, I have a colleague who is asexual and polyamorous and was like, oh, this distinction between nurturance and eroticism, you're just putting into words, like you're giving me words to describe myself to others who couldn't understand. And we've actually done research and we find that sort of people actually, not everyone, but people do sort of enjoy and understand doing SET. And they enjoy it at a higher rate than experts, like than academic experts, so to speak. And when it comes to the gender sex 3x3, so far we actually haven't experienced much pushback, in part because it's just in press. Like it's out there so you can see the article and it's been sort of in press for a while. But I don't think it's been formally published, although they don't always let you know, and I don't check every day. But that I do see more uptake, in part because it really is just those 3 quick questions. What you do with it though, I think some people get this idea that there's the freedom and you're making choice. And what we're doing is we're foregrounding choice. No matter what you're asking and what you're measuring, you're making choices. And we are sort of, in my methods, foregrounding that. We're foregrounding the construction of these measures, that you're constructing your groups, that there's, for those of you who are familiar with like Karen Broad, like that diffraction process going on, that whatever measure you use is only going to let it through certain phenomena. Like it never is going to sort of get at a wholeness or reality, but although we want to do that as much as possible. And so I'm hopeful for the uptake there. And one neat thing is we saw actually a society using the gender sex 3x3 questions in just their membership survey. So we're really hopeful that that will take off a little bit more. It's not going to be perfect, but we think it allows for much more identification of more axes of gender. So many times there's sort of this assumption that there's gender, and that includes your gender location, it includes your gender trajectory, it includes your binary relation. And this allows us to get at those for when they are branched or when all those axes matter. So yeah, I hope I was able to get at some of your question.
Thank you. I think there's a couple questions here that I'm going to try to combine together, and let's see if I can do this in a way that's eloquent and clear. So we have one question that asks about the delivery method of these measures, whether you think they would work in survey form versus in-person conversation, things about that kind of modality and delivery. And then we have a kind of connected question that asks about developmental or language level that might be needed in order to make use of these questions. So they feel of the same type. So maybe I'll ask them together.
These are great questions. And I might, there is a few different elements. So I have a feeling I might miss one. So just bring me back if I do.
Of course.
So we have done it in person in qualitative research. And that works well. We've also done it online in qualitative research, and that works well. We've also developed a version that doesn't have an intermediary, like, because the first two studies we did with SCT were all with a person there who could answer questions. But we developed an online version that doesn't have a researcher there, and people actually really like it and find it understandable. And then sometimes, you know, we tend to assume that a person there is better, but for many people, that's not the case. Like, they've had experiences with like authority, like violence of authority. They don't want really to like tell a person or talk through a person. They want to make sense of it themselves and not necessarily be having to like be identified as an individual sharing this, you know. So we find it works in both those ways. The 3x3 we did what's called, I think it's called cognitive interviewing. So, but that was online through a questionnaire. So it wasn't directly interviewed. We also have those videos we developed are like instruction videos for how to do SCT. So people watch those, whether we're doing in-person interviews or Zoom interviews or no interviews and just people do it themselves. That all seems to work. And what we have, obviously, our online studies require people to have a certain level of technical proficiency. We also recognize, for example, that people with blindness or sight issues won't be able to use the diagrams for SCT because they really rely on a visual engagement. So that's a limitation for them. And we're trying to think of ways to work around, not to work around that, but to develop something else, which we haven't done yet, but we hope to eventually in the next 5 to 10 years. Which sounds so long, but I guess I'm old enough that doesn't feel so long anymore. And in terms, and in terms of level 2, so one of the things is like, this is often a common thing. What do you do with children and or youth? I only informally have I spoken with some youth, like some kids of friends who wanted to talk about it with me, or at conferences, sometimes people bring their kids. And what I found is youth, like adolescents, are able to make sense of this, no problem. And a high school teacher, actually contacted me about materials and just reported back today. I got an email saying that he used the materials in class and that it was amazing. Not that it's always going to be amazing, but I'm working with some other folks who work with children about how to think more about gender sex measurement there. There's some assumptions and sort of ageism and adultism about what kids do and don't understand, but there also are some realities that like there's certain phenomena that might be differently experienced by people of different age phases. That also isn't just younger folks, but also people who are more or less connected to sort of narratives around gender, sex, and diversity. And then in terms of level of comprehension, so one project that I hope to get involved with, I got invited to, and it hasn't gone anywhere yet, is working with people of intellectual disabilities and some developmental disabilities, because obviously well, not obviously, but in our culture, given disableism and ableism, there's a lot of, there's lots of people doing good work, but there's not enough. And we're interested in how this can be more useful for folks who with varied engagements and varied intellectual levels and so on. And again, that will be like in partnership with communities and folks who have expertise in that, including people with lived experience. So I think I got all the things, but I'm not sure.
I think you did. And actually another one came in while you were chatting that I think is connected, and that is about whether the survey is available in other languages, and perhaps as an extension of that, whether it's been tested in other languages, whether we know it kind of translates linguistically and also cross-culturally. Any comment about the language translation?
That's a great question. So we have translated, as I said, just briefly, our zine into 4 languages with 3 more coming: Slovakian, Arabic, and Portuguese. And the ones we have are Belarusian, Spanish, French, and Italian. We've translated the workbook into French, but we haven't actually translated the actual so the workbook you can do in French or English, but we haven't translated the workbook into other languages. And we have an online platform coming that researchers or people or educators or clinicians can use. Excuse me. And that's been incredibly complicated for those of you who do like anything like this, you'll know. But that right now is only available in English. But if I find partners who are interested in working in other languages, like I have some funds to support that. So if that's something people are excited about, please get it. That's what happened. People just got in touch and were like, I'd like to translate this. And I was like, okay. And we talked about it. And sometimes they did it for free. And sometimes I provided an honorarium and so on.
Wonderful.
So we'd love to do that. And I just want to say, the linguistic issues are like more than just linguistic because they're also cultural. So some languages have gender built more deeply into them than English. Some have it no different. Some don't have different terms for gender and sex. So that even the concept of gender sex might not travel in the same ways. So in some ways, it's like, it's not just like a translation question or linguistic one. It's also very deeply like academic. Like there are dissertations to understand this work. I think I'd be excited to see to be involved in it or see the outcomes of it.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more, and I'll ask an aspect of this question because there's a few moving parts, and I know it's something that you and I have actually talked about quite a bit before, and that is whether you have a strategy for what happens if a cell size is too small. So how do you decide to collapse categories? Is there a kind of sample size consideration, statistical power if we were to try to do this in quantitative research, things about that kind of potential challenge?
Yeah, and I think what's exciting about the 3x3 is it allows you to do some planning in a way that I feel like right now is often quite haphazard for people, including some of my own past research. So it's kind of like a mild criticism of what a lot of us are doing. But so I think one of the nice things about the 3x3 is we could first think, okay, do our research questions specifically, do we have specific cells that we want to make sure we have representation in? And then we can make that happen as you know, in the ways we do. And you can check out this toolkit to see some of the strategies for that that Dr. Loic leads. And then we tend to recruit for diversity. And I'm really interested in whom we can get. I really don't want to decide a priori what reality is. Now, sometimes that means our samples are too small to include in statistical analyses. People have very different ways of going about this. And I don't think there's one right answer. I think the key is to come to a reasoned and justified conclusion and explain it very transparently. So sometimes we'll say, here's who we got in our study. And for our analyses, here's who we were able to focus on. Then people know, for example, if there was this other, let's say there's 3 people in the allobinary, allogender category, which tends to be one of our smaller ones. Maybe there'll be a bunch of studies that have a few people and they can look at it, or maybe that will be reason for us to next time not target in that's such a bad word, but focus on that group. And I'm a big fan of, like, sometimes people see it as a failure if you don't get enough in every cell, but I'm like, if you understand intersectionality, you cannot have, you know, n equals 20 for every intersection. Like that literally is impossible. Like it's just, no matter how hard you tried, even if you had nationally representative, like for every possible intersection, that's just not how it works. And so for me, it's really important that we are thoughtful, clear, transparent. And when we repeatedly are not getting enough sample to include in analyses, that we talk about that and maybe take steps in other studies to rectify that. And I think it's really important to think across research programs. Like no one study will be able to do all the things, and no one research program will either. But to try to think across research program rather than within study as the target for sort of thinking about equity, if that makes sense, and thinking about justice. Obviously, you want it within study, but you also really need to take this broader program across the studies you're involved in, because realistically, that's just a more realistic way. And I think you're less likely to get to that burnout or that feeling of like, well, I can't do anything. I don't know what to do. I never get enough and everyone's criticizing me. Like thinking about it broadly, think about it to be transparent and so on.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. I would like to just have everyone join me in a virtual round of applause for Dr. Van Anders and the incredible talk that they shared with us today.